I've turned up even though I'm really not feeling very well, because this to me is one of the most important tools I've discovered in the last few years, and it's been absolutely mindset changing for a ton of people. Cynefin is a framework for making sense of the world and different types of problems and situations that we encounter in the world. I'm now using this on projects where it's not about software, and it's actually helping us work out which bits of problems require those feedback loops that you get in Agile and Lean processes. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about differentiation and why Cynefin is important, how I use it. I'm going to talk a little bit about deliberate discovery, which plays very heavily into the complex space in some of the problems I encounter. I'm going to talk about capabilities, and particularly how I use the complexity estimates along with capabilities to do high-level planning and to help talk about projects and products in a way that's quite holistic and ends up with pretty good delivery. And I'm also going to talk about shallow dive into chaos, which is using the chaos domain in Cynefin to elicit ideas and experiments from large groups of people. Okay, so I wanted to just start by telling a story, and this is one of my favorite stories, about something that it was completely unexpected and couldn't possibly have been predicted in a month of Sundays. It's about a company called Ludicor. They had this game that they had online. It's a multiplayer online game called Neverending, and they wanted more people to come and play the game. So what they did, they set up a site to share screenshots of the game. We've got this amazing game. Come and share your screenshots of the game, your pictures of the game here. And you can use it to share images with your fellow gamers. And other people will see it and they'll come on board as well. So they set up this site, and indeed people were sharing screenshots and photos of kittens. It's the internet, right? And their families, and their holiday snaps, and their friends, and nights out in the restaurant, and all of the other images that people seem to insist on putting on the internet. And that became Flickr. Started as a multiplayer online game. You couldn't have predicted it. I'm working with a payments gateway provider that used to be an astrology site. They couldn't predict it either. So, whenever we do something new that nobody's done before, whenever we take on the capability that's never been delivered before, we frequently discover something about it. And if any of you are familiar with this book, Waltzing with Bears, Tom DeMarco and Timothy Lister? Yeah? This starts on chapter 1 with this, if a project has no risks, don't do it. And the reason is, if you're doing something that has no risks, it's because you've done it before. You know how to do it. And you're just doing the same project with the same people, the same technology, the same requirements, the same everything again. And we never do that, not least because if you were to do it with human beings, they would be utterly bored doing it the second time round, so they wouldn't be the same people as they were the first time. Whenever we do anything, it usually has some aspect of something new that you've not had before. And certainly anything which gets the label project has it. And if you find that, that new place is where the highest amount of discovery happens. It's where the unknown unknowns are. So we call those differentiators. The example I like to use is camera phones. So do you remember the very first camera phones? The really early ones? Kyocera made one of the very early ones, and they pointed the camera towards the user because they thought people would want to use it to make video calls. And the internet didn't really support video calls, and it didn't quite grow quickly enough, but they didn't know that. They didn't foresee the rise of the duck face and the selfie, you know. But as it became more and more understood, so Nokia particularly popularized it. And now we have a great understanding of how to fit a camera and a phone on the same device and the kind of things you can do with it. So that differentiator has been spoiled. So Nokia took that differentiator and they copied it, and that's what we call spoiling the differentiator, spoilers. Hands up if you've got a camera on your phone. Look at hands up if you don't have a camera on your phone. Nobody here. Okay, I've done this a lot. 3 people so far. Hands up if you don't have a phone. I've met one of those, astonishingly. Okay, what else does a camera phone need to do apart from the camera side? Make phone calls, thank you very much. It also needs to be a phone. How well do we understand making phone calls on a mobile phone, even in the days before the camera phone? Pretty well. It's pretty boring. They're what we call commodities, the table stakes, the things we need to have just to play the game. Right? David Anderson gave me these terms. He's the Kanban guy. Devs, hands up if you're a dev or have a dev background. If you're asked to do something over and over and over again that you understand really well and is very boring, what do you do? Automate it, automate it, thank you very much. Oh, it's not there yet. Okay, I'll talk about the innovation cycle a little bit later, but that's what we do, we automate. And the act of automating is itself a complex problem, a differentiator, if you're automating something for the first time, okay? There are some other types of problems, expedited problems. If you've heard of night trading, end of 2012, they released something to production that was duplicating their trades. And since they're only hedging half of those, it cost them quite a lot of money, $13 billion before they were able to shut it off. That was quite expensive. It's not the most expensive software failure, right? There's also the thing that we do in software called katas, exercises, things where we're doing something very, very simple, very, very predictable over and over again. So you can see we've got predictable stuff on this side and less predictable stuff over this side, things where you can't correlate cause and effect in the same way. In this space where you're doing something new, it's possible to look back and see how that's happened. It's possible to look back and go, oh yeah, well, we can now see why that photo sharing site was so effective and completely made Flickr change direction. We can see why an astrology site that couldn't find a decent payments gateway provider and decided to fill that niche would end up with that niche becoming their business. But you couldn't predict that. And if you're familiar with Lean Startup, this is Lean Startup's pivoting space, right? So I'm going to show you how this relates to Cynefin. The hardest thing about Cynefin is spelling it. I always ask, like, who's heard of Cynefin? And I get 3 people put their hands up, and then I show this word. And now who's heard of Cynefin? And I usually get about 20. Who's heard of Cynefin? About 20. Okay. So the way this maps to Cynefin, we get these simple problems, and a simple problem is one that a child can solve. Your chain falls off your bicycle, you put it back on again. Very predictable, very easy. We can categorize problems in this space. We go, oh, it's one of those problems. Okay. As we get more and more complicated, you know what it's like when you've got a 6-piece wooden jigsaw, one of those ones you have as a kid? Yeah? And you start getting better at them, you move to 1,000-piece jigsaws. How do you do a 1,000-piece jigsaw? One piece at a time. You start with the edges normally, or with the corners. Sometimes you might decide, you're bored of that, you start with a particular colour, you start with a particular character in it. We've done kind of, I'll do the snowman, you do Santa Claus. There are lots of ways of doing it, and there are all good ways of doing it, but they require a little bit of expertise. You don't just start with a 1,000-piece jigsaw, or you're going to get very frustrated. Complicated problems do require expertise. And the example that Cognitive Edge, Dave Snowden works for Cognitive Edge, he's the guy who came up with this. The example that they always use is a watch. A watchmaker can take a watch apart and put it back together again. And it's got a very predictable outcome, otherwise it's not a very good watch. Similarly, a car mechanic can take your car apart, put it back together again. Anyone here heard of frog versus bicycle thinking? You can take a bicycle apart and put it back together again, but you can't do it with a frog. A frog is complex. The complex domain, things are more than just the sum of their parts. There are emergent properties as a result of the interaction of those parts. And if you separate those parts and break those properties, break those interactions, it's really hard to put it back together again. The thing about complex domains, as well as the fact that cause and effect are only correlated in retrospect, is that you get sometimes what we call complex adaptive systems. And those are systems where the agents within them can observe and change their own systems. Basically anything involving human beings tends to be complex. So in the complicated space, we can analyze and use expertise to solve the problem. But in the complex space, because it's not predictable, because outcomes emerge, the practices we use to solve them have to emerge as well. And we can't analyze it. We can't decide up front what processes we're going to have. Instead, we have to experiment. We have to probe. They call it probe. The last domain is the chaotic domain. Second from last domain. In the chaotic domain, cause and effect are not correlated in any way which makes sense to us. So the examples they use is accident and emergency. Your house is on fire. Right? You've got to get out. Somebody's bleeding to death. And chaos does usually resolve itself, but it doesn't always resolve itself in your favor. I was having a bit of discussion about the Cynefin framework, and Ron Jeffrey says, well, look, is it wise to do something that's not safe to fail, even in chaos? I said, well, if you don't get out of your house and it burns down with you in it, it's not safe to fail, but it doesn't stop you trying to get out. And some of the most novel practices have come about from this chaotic space because people have nothing to lose, because you have a sense of urgency. I'm currently looking at the ideas of evolution and revolution. And when you have that sense of urgency, that desire to change, revolution becomes the thing to do. The idea of acting, throwing some constraints around the problem so that you can get that understanding, so that you can move into complexity and actually have a safe space to try things out in. There is the fifth domain, disorder, which is the thing in the middle. Disorder is when we don't know which of these domains dominates. And you won't know when you're in disorder. Otherwise, you know. We tend to behave according to whichever our preferred domain is. So if you've ever experienced a project manager demanding accurate estimates, which is a term I hate and have just been picking up arguments with people outside as a result, but accurate estimates so that they can predict exactly how long a project is going to take. Or predict how long some smaller piece of work is going to take, which is even worse, especially if it's something new that you've never done before. Oh, wait, I'm a dev. I've never done this before. Well, how long will it take? Well, I don't know. I've never done it before. Well, I need a number. Okay, well, that's what estimategoat.com is for. You rub the goat, it'll give you a number. Down here at the bottom, we have this cliff. And this cliff is the border between simplicity and chaos. Is called complacency. It's very easy to fall over the cliff into chaos. It's very hard to get back the other way. Normally, if that happens, you actually have to really quickly throw some constraints around the problem, work out which server it is and switch it off. Stop trading. You're going to lose some money. It's going to be painful. But then you can actually start resolving it, move into complexity, try some stuff out, and get all the way back round again before the problem is fixed. So that is Cynefin. I said I was going to talk a little bit about the innovation cycle as well. So this is the innovation cycle. You'll move from this complex stuff. You come to understand it, and as you understand it, so GPS systems is a really great example. We now understand how GPS works. There was a time when it was new and people were coming up with GPS providers left, right, and center. And now all of our phones do it. And they're having to come up with something new that isn't just about GPS because nobody really cares anymore. And then we automate. We get bored of doing the same web CRUD form over and over again. We come up with Rails, which is definitely a complex problem. So as we automate, we provide a base to differentiate it on again, and this is how innovation happens. So I wanted to show how I actually come up with objective measures of which domain something lies in. And this is particularly, don't worry about chaos because you shouldn't be analysing things in chaos. You shouldn't be doing project planning in chaos. You should be acting to fix the chaos. But looking at the most complex stuff and round to the simple. This is how I actually get people to estimate it, and it's a really simple scale. It's also pretty objective rather than subjective because it's not dependent on what you think, it's what the world thinks. And if you don't know, treat it as complex. Okay, so if you don't know, then this is what you know. So 5, nobody's ever done it before. You're looking at a problem that has not been solved. And it might be, it hasn't been solved in this context. We want to do this quicker than anybody else. We want to do this more effectively than anybody else. We want to do this at a bigger scale than anybody's done it before. Whatever the newest aspect is, it's usually either a 5 or a 4. Somebody outside the organisation, outside your group, has done it before. You have no access to expertise. Now note, all you know is that somebody has done the bit that you can see of it. You don't know what they discovered, you don't know how long it took, you don't know who got fired, you don't know which regulators came out the woodwork, so it's still very high discovery. 3, somebody in the company's done it before, or we have access to expertise. We can get an expert in who's done this before. Someone in the team's done it before, and we all know how to do it. So on that 5-point scale, you can probably see fairly easily it maps like this. Over in the 5s and 4s, if you try and analyse a 5 and 4, a thing where even the business haven't done it before, you'll end up in what we call analysis paralysis, and you'll hear people thrashing around the argument, trying to decide what the right answer is. Whenever you hear that, if they're familiar with this, you can just say to them, well, look, this sounds like something we've never done before. Can we try something out and get some feedback on it instead? Can we create an experiment? Can we create several experiments? A/B testing is a really great example of things in this space. Concurrent set-based engineering. It's running multiple experiments simultaneously. And you can tell which ones worked in retrospect. So it's not a matter of making one change and then watching. You can make multiple changes at once. So here's some examples. Self-driving cars. Okay, we've now got the cars, but we're still trying to get them legal and on the roads. The manned Mars mission. They're doing some experiments in Antarctica where it's marginally more safe. Apple fan base, right? It's a differentiator. The fact they have that fan base is enabling them to do things that other companies can't. That and their vast bank account. Mending watches. We already explained it's complicated. SAP. It's boring, but requires expertise. GPS. We understand it now. User registration. Please do not make me talk through user registration. It's user registration. It looks like Twitter or it looks like Stack Overflow, and that's usually enough to analyze a problem. What I tend to do with something like user registration is I'll ask, well, look, is there anything different about user registration this time compared to normal? Is there anything different about creating users, updating users, deleting users? And I'll name the scenarios that are associated with it. And if it's Blizzard, they go, oh, well, deleting users, we don't actually delete them, right? We say we've deleted them, but we keep their account around and then mail them every 6 months and say, come back to World of Warcraft, we still have all your characters. And you go, no, because I've got a life now, thank you. I am 4 years clean, 4 years clean. Skyrim's a problem. Okay. But it's enough to ask, is there anything different? And if it isn't, don't spend a ton of time analysing as you move into this 2s and 1s space, right? You know how to do user registration. You know how to handle dates, unless you're in the energy business, in which case ordering energy from one country that has a different date time to you when some days are 23 hours worth of energy and some days are 25 hours worth of energy, and that's not the same from different countries. That can get interesting. So apparently that requires expertise. And anything which makes you go, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, just go straight into the expedite lane and you don't need to worry about analysing it. You get the experts in, you get the people who most recently made the changes and might know what it is. You also drill in chaos. You drill for chaos, right? So crews who work in emergency services, airline crews, will drill so that when chaos happens, they all know what their roles are and they can act immediately. I also wanted to make a little note about deadlines. I found that people have really interesting behaviour around deadlines. When there is a real deadline, people will treat it with respect. They will not ride things right up to the deadline and make people work overtime and stuff like that, because then you won't be able to ship anything useful. So for instance, I was working at The Guardian when we had to get the galleries out in time for the Oscars. I've worked with people who have summer exams, Christmas, things like that, deadlines that really aren't going to move on their behalf. I've also worked with people who have made a commitment inside the organisation and who have reputation at stake. And those are the deadlines where people seem willing to do anything to ship as much as you possibly can, regardless of the quality, because of their reputation. And it's not about the good products, it's about them saving their reputation. I don't call those deadlines anymore, I call them sad lines. Nobody's going to die and your project is still going to be all right, but somebody will be sad if you don't meet them, okay? So you can also look at the different behaviours that happen as a result. I'm not going to suggest any solutions, but I just wanted to call out that the sad line will throw you into chaos more often than the deadline will. Okay. That was an intro to Cynefin. Right, capabilities. I want to start by introducing something called feature injection. And this is how Chris Matz taught it to me. It's not how he teaches it now. But it's caused me to do quite a bit of thinking about how you can actually help smooth out some of the uncertainty at scale, how you can actually do planning when you've got large amounts of uncertainty. And I use this in combination with those complexity estimates. So a project which is, in a company which is mature has a vision, always has a vision. And the vision is something which makes money, saves money, or protects money. We have had problems with companies who've decided to try and use up this quarter's budget so they can get it again next quarter, and it's a project they don't really care about. I'm not going to talk about those kind of projects. Ideally, you've got a primary stakeholder who is the person who's championed that vision, who's fought for the budget. If any of you are doing Scrum, that is the product owner, the person who has championed for that budget, who has fought to get that project started. If you've got anybody with that title who is not that person, they're acting as a proxy. And it's sometimes really useful to recognise that. There are also other stakeholders whose goals need to be taken into account if you're going to go live with that project. So legal guys, architecture, the fact the code's got to be maintainable in 5 years. Security. Marketing sometimes. The fact that you need to train the users. There are a ton of things need to happen. I'm working with a project at the moment, only 10% of what we're doing is actually code. And to get those business goals, we deliver capabilities. The capability to comment on a Guardian article, the capability to book a copper trade, the capability to scale this service to 3 million people. We then deliver features, and a feature is the concrete thing we're actually going to use to get the capability. And at this point, you can actually start looking at UIs, deciding whether it's going to be mobile or web. The capabilities, we don't know how we're going to deliver them. It's literally the capability. And you'll frequently find that most of the capabilities we deliver in an automated way, using computers, already have a different counterpart, perhaps using Excel spreadsheets, or people running around with pieces of paper. If you could put pixies in a computer that did the job, you'd be able to deliver those capabilities, right? The capability to get £20 out the cash machine, as long as the pixie hasn't fallen asleep, you're good. But the features, the actual widgets that we use to deliver the capabilities, they change. They change all the time. We try something out, it doesn't work. We try something different. We show it to people, they go, oh, that's not quite what I meant, and they'll elaborate on the capability that they were really looking for. If you're familiar with Tom Gilb's work on Evo, the thing he calls goals, I call capabilities, but all of his work around actually putting numbers on these things, saying how quickly you want to deliver something, how performant it needs to be, what's the current performance, etc. It's completely relevant to the capabilities. A story is just a slice through a feature to get faster feedback. That's all it is. Those of you who's working in Scrum teams still? Yeah? Yeah? This is a great way to look at stories. You just want to get feedback within 2 weeks, and sometimes features are a bit too big to do that, so you're slicing through so you've got something to show to your stakeholders when they turn up. If you can get feedback faster than that, do it. I'm into BDD. I like to talk through different scenarios and sometimes deliver them independently or use them to help slice up the stories. And then we deliver code. Or if we're not working with software, we deliver the idea turned into something real. And this does include the ops guys. I treat ops as secondary stakeholders. They have goals that you need to achieve, and you need to take those into account. But I explicitly make sure they're included as secondary stakeholders in the project. By the way, anyone working with user stories? They're not really user stories. As a user, I want the bank to debit my account when I take £20 out. No, wait. I really don't want the bank to do that. As a Guardian user, I want to fill in this capture box. Right? A lot of things that we use are actually there for secondary stakeholders. They're there because they need to be for them. They are stakeholder stories. Even the stuff which we use, if we're not actually paying for it, it's not normally for our benefit. It's some advertising executive somewhere. As a user, I want to see ads all over my web page. Yeah, no, not so much. Especially not if they're World of Warcraft ads again. Okay. So this is how it breaks down: vision, goal, capability, feature, story, scenario, code, and this line here. Past this line, things don't change. This way, it does for a project. So hold on a moment. I've already told you that breaking things down like this only works in the complicated space. You can't do that in the complex space. If you could, you would get projects would look like this, right? They'd be these beautiful fractal things. And we'd go down the pub and we'd talk about how everything was on time and on budget and just fell out and it was gorgeous and everything just worked beautifully. We don't. What do we talk about when we go down the pub? We talk about the bits we forgot and the bits we discovered and didn't know about. And, oh, look, turns out that these guys were all connected to each other and we didn't need this. This is what a real project looks like, right? Dan North, who I managed to see briefly today, said he calls these oh crap moments. This is what a project is made up of. Not the beautiful work coming out, but the discoveries. So the Agile Manifesto says we're discovering how to deliver software by doing it and helping others do it. I don't believe this is Agile's differentiator. We've been doing this since the waterfall days. We've been doing this for ages. We've been doing this before it was even called Agile. But what Agile has taught us is how to discover stuff. We are discovering how to discover stuff. And the whole of the Lean and Kanban movement has found new, exciting ways of discovering stuff by doing it and helping others do it. The granularity is only there so we know how to get feedback and who to get feedback from. So in a differentiating word, we need to probe, we need to try something out. We want to make those discoveries as quickly as possible. And Dan North came up with this thing called deliberate discovery. He says, assume ignorance, right? You don't know everything about a project because some of it's new. Assume second order ignorance. There is stuff you don't know. But guess what? It's going to be associated with the new stuff you've never done before. Optimize for discovery. That means do the new stuff first. Those 5s and 4s, hit them early on in your planning, right? Do them first, because that's where most of the discoveries are going to be. That's going to tell you whether the project is a go or not. I wanted to touch on this because I thought it was pretty magic. This is Sensemaker. Sensemaker is a way of discovering stuff at a human level very quickly. It's a project which, it's a piece of software that Cognitive Edge produced. What it does, it gathers stories, and then it tags the stories on these triads. So you can see they've got this triad. So as an example, this one says politics, process, and circumstance. You'll say, which is your story more about, politics, process, and circumstance? I think they asked people to tell a story about Singapore society in this one. You know, what's your story about? It's about Singapore society. They did one on past, present and future. And they found that there was a big hole in future. Lots of people had lots of stories about the past and the present, but nobody was really telling stories about things they were looking forward to. And they're very careful to avoid that bias when they ask for the stories. So it's just an interesting thing. So you can actually get patterns out of this. I've been using this in a complex space. They've got, rather than just a triad, they've got these dyads as well. So a dyad, what you want is two negatives on a dyad to get that spacing. If you ask people whether they like something or whether they don't, they will usually always go to one or the other. Okay? They will rarely sit in the middle unless they don't care. But when you actually have two negative things, we've got the complete absence of a thing over here and too much of a thing over here. And it's a great way of finding out what people's opinion is of what you're doing, what people's opinion is of the changes you're trying to make. So you can actually get thought experiments happening before you make the commitment of actually implementing something. So as an example, I used this when I was teaching people pair programming to get a feel for the pair programming in the room, and also to help them appreciate the variety of different ideas, different opinions about pair programming. So I said, okay, complete absence of a thing. If you think you never, ever, ever want to pair program ever, you go to this side of the room. If you want to pair program on absolutely everything, you go to that side. And of course, neither of those are necessarily good. So people will pick where they want to move to, and I got them to think about which point they were going to move to first, and then I got them to move. So they all arranged themselves in a line. Now, the reason I got them to move, got them to pick the point, then move, is because human beings come to consensus as soon as they start to connect. If I had said, just go find your place on the line, they would have been influenced by the people around them. They would have been influenced by where the lead dev, who's that really charismatic guy that we all want to be like, went to. So instead, I got them to think about it as individuals. And this is the shallow dive into chaos. Getting people to come up with their own ideas, or ideas in small homogeneous groups. So I actually ran a little exercise with some people over WebEx to try and show how quickly people come to consensus. I said, can you guys think of one way people come to consensus and put it into the chat window? And there's only 6 people on this call, so that the first person said voting, and the second person said polling, and the third person says, yeah, I'll go with polling as well. And then I had to explain why I was giggling so much. But people, as soon as you connect, come to consensus. So if you want to generate really great experiments, rather than letting people talk about it, rather than letting people sit and analyze it through conversation, get them to work on their own or in small homogeneous groups. And by homogeneous, you want people with the same kind of ideas in groups together. So it's completely the opposite of the cross-functional team. You put the devs in one group, the BAs in one group, the testers in one group. Something Cognitive Edge do is frequently pull out those of us who consider ourselves to be a bit alpha and tend to dominate conversations into one group, where we can happily yell across the table at each other without worrying. So we've got this innovation cycle. But when you want to generate the kind of good emergent outcomes, you take this shallow dive into chaos. You separate people. You make them act as individuals, which is something we do in chaos. Do you remember when you're on a plane, what do they say about the face masks? Always put your own on before you help anyone else. So in chaos, we act as individuals. And by deliberately separating people like that, you actually get this shallow dive into chaos. Now we've been able to reduce 2.5-hour meetings involving 40 people to about 40-minute meetings in which we get a much bigger variety of opinions by making people write on Post-it notes. That's simple. This is where silent work really comes in. And from that, ideas have come, experiments have come, rather than the entire group collapsing into a false consensus because one guy has a strong voice, or 2 people have strong voices and they're arguing it out with everybody else watching. So whenever you see that analysis paralysis happening, those arguments around analysis, those arguments over what the right problem is, what the right solution is, instead you can think, well, look, guys, is this two experts arguing, in which case pick one of them, pick the one that's easiest to change because it's just good and it'll work. But if it's something new that you've never done before, if it's something that's genuinely in that complex space and you hear that's happening, break up, go, okay, well, look, can we just generate some experiments, ideas for experiments around this? We've actually done this. I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit theoretical because I only came across it last week. Pal Kaminsky's been doing some stuff with Eliyahu Goldratt's decision trees. And he has this way of turning round assumptions. So if we say, oh, well, you know, we absolutely need money in order to be able to eat, he turns it round, puts absolutes on the negative, and says, okay, so there's absolutely no situation ever in which somebody can eat without money. And of course, then it's really easy to come up with the exceptions. So if you can say something like, well, we absolutely have to register users in order to use this service. Yeah, because no service ever worked without registering users. Oh, well, Reddit did. Reddit doesn't require user registration in order to use it. Oh, yeah, that's interesting. And suddenly you can come up with not analysis, because so Eliyahu Goldratt reckons this solves all problems. I don't, but I do reckon it's a great way to come up with more experiments by turning those assumptions around. I haven't tried it yet, but if anybody does, please get back to me because I'm really interested in that. Something else that Cognitive Edge do, they do a thing called ritual descent. So they'll generate these experiments, take them out into the big wide world, and the idea is that your little group that's come up with the experiment shows it to another group. And all you're allowed to do is present it. You get the person with the biggest ego and the most robust mind, I guess, presents it to the other group. The other group are not allowed to ask questions. I always say you're allowed to say, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, can you repeat it? But you're not allowed to ask any questions at all. Because as soon as you ask questions, now you're communicating, and that will inevitably cause consensus to happen, will cause you to modify how you were presenting it. And you don't want that. So you present the other group, then rip your experiment to pieces. They go, this is why it's not safe to fail. This is why, if it does work, you won't be able to anchor it, you won't be able to amplify it. This is how you won't know it's succeeding and how you won't know it's failing. Here are the side effects that you can foresee that you haven't thought about because it happened over here last time, etc. While they're doing that, the person who is presenting either turns their chair or puts a mask on so that their emotional reaction cannot be seen, because that would cause consensus to happen. We hate upsetting people, right? So I actually did this over a webcam. I said, well, I'm training you guys as BDD trainers. Let's imagine that that is the experiment. I'm going to shut off the webcam and shut off my mic so you can't see or hear me. You guys discuss why it's going to fail. You guys rip this experiment, tell me where the holes are. And it was some of the best feedback I have ever had. And we still had a day to pick up the pieces and to actually fill in those holes. It was fantastic. So I highly recommend it for anybody looking for feedback on their work. Treat your work as an experiment and get people to do this. So yeah, we did it over a webcam. A quick mention of BDD, just for those who haven't seen it. BDD is the art of talking through examples in conversations so that you can understand the problem better. So it's an analysis technique. Works really well there. If you try and do it down here, people get bored. Nobody wants to talk through the example and the scenario where you make a phone call to your gran. It's boring enough doing it for half the people in this room. I can tell people giggles. If you do it over here, you'll find the outcomes are uncertain, they're unknown. The business haven't thought of that scenario. Oh, didn't think of that. I don't know. Okay? Works really well in the middle, but you can use it as a sense-making framework. You can have the conversations anyway and listen for people being bored and listen for people being uncertain. And that phrase, can you give me an example, suddenly becomes very, very powerful. So what does that mean? It means this is boring. Fred bought a microwave and bought it back for a refund. We know that scenario pretty well, right? This is really, really boring for anybody who uses Cucumber. They're adding two numbers together. because you need to talk to a domain expert about that. And Zach is changing this example for me. This is interesting. Fred bought a 120 kilogram fridge freezer and wants a refund. It's at his house. He didn't bring it in on his shoulder. It's 120 kilo fridge freezer. So now what are you going to do? And I guarantee the first people who solved that problem discovered quite a lot about the behavior of their customers and their delivery staff and the number of people who don't know how to plug something in. And obviously that's a solved problem now. I don't know what the right answer is, but it will have been solved by now. But there are plenty of problems you'll encounter which haven't been. So that's how I approach this. I have a goal, capabilities, and I will always look for whichever one is newest, hasn't been delivered first. What's the most interesting scenario? Can we find one scenario that has never been addressed? And start with that. And code that, and hard code the connections to the database because they're boring. We know how to connect to a database, right? Just hard code the data, get the UI in front of people because they've never played with that UI before. Anybody remember this game? Asteroids. So I got this off of Tobias, who got it from Michael James. What happens when you shoot the big asteroids? They break up into medium ones, and how do the medium ones move compared to the big ones? They're faster, and when you shoot the medium ones, tiny little ones, and how do the tiny little ones move? Really, really fast. How do you play this game when you first start and then you discover that that was a bad idea and you die very quickly? You shoot the big ones and split them into medium ones, and then you split the medium ones into tiny ones, and then the tiny ones are flying all over the screen and you can't keep track of them, and that's what you don't do with your stories either, because they will move too fast and they will kill you. Goals stay the same for a role. Capabilities stay the same for a project. It is enough to plan just with the capabilities. We have done this. We did this on a big energy trader. So whenever I talked to them about the project, they would always draw the three main architectural components, and we then put the capabilities that each of those components would deliver. The capability to book this type of trade, the capability to generate this kind of risk report, the capability to calculate this particular risk. That was what it was. And then I got them, because it was my first pass at doing this, to just put a red dot on anything that was new and they had never done before. And that was enough to identify the risk. We also, because we were being asked to be doing Scrum, we put some story points on them. I said, which is the smallest? Call it 20. Which is the biggest? Call it 20 times bigger? Call it 400. Is there one in the middle that's about in the middle, 200? Yep, that one. Okay, well now we've got some range. Let's rank the rest of them. That took about an hour, and then afterwards I said, okay, double anything with a red dot on, unless you can come up with a good reason why not. And that was enough in these loose estimates for the PM office to be really, really happy. And it turned out that it was actually reasonably accurate. We could tell that we were going to finish in about a year, which was about as long as we had. Or we thought we could. We actually discovered something very, very early on by attacking the risky stuff that ended up delaying the project 6 months. And it was to do with a dependency, because we had identified it as a risk and hit it really early on. And it was the only time that I've actually seen that kind of discovery result in an extended deadline from the board. They agreed that what we had come up with, what we had decided was reasonable. So here's what it looks like. We take the capabilities, we put them on the board, we split them into features and stories, and then they travel like normal. And we tend to give the capabilities each their own swim lane, just so you can track all the stuff that's associated with it. And we hit the 4s and 5s first these days. Yeah. So that 5-point scale, plan everything. The other lovely thing about the 3s is you know you need expertise, so you can make sure you have access to the experts. If you need to schedule outside experts, you can make sure you do that. And it's a nice explicit way to do it. I never worry about 2s and 1s. 2s and 1s can be offshored. User registration. So the idea is that we want to do the least amount of investment possible before we actually go ahead and implement something. If you do a ton of analysis up front, you end up back in that horrible waterfall world where we don't want to be. This is a really nice way of looking to see how lightweight your analysis should be, and it's different for the 3s than the 4s and 5s. It's different for the 1s and 2s. The 1s and 2s, you want to know what's different and find a parallel, find a library you can use, find something off the shelf. The 3s, you want to talk to the domain experts, get their knowledge out of them, and that's a high analysis area. And the 4s and 5s, you want to know just enough to actually start out, to try something and get feedback. So if you're into real options, I think I'm running out of time now. It feels like I'm running out of time. I have run out of time. 5 minutes ago, right, yeah. 5 minutes to go, or I go? I go, right, so I'm already out of time. I'm not going to tell the story, see? I made options. This is a great book. It's a graphic novel that explains real options, beautiful for working in that complex space. I'm in it, and John Terry, whose time I am horribly using up here, is also in it. And it's a graphic novel. It takes 2-3 hours to read. Good fun read. It's about a lady called Rose who's trying to rescue her project, so it's like The Goal, only with pictures. If anybody wants to know about deliberate discovery exercise, that's also something I put in there just so you're aware of it. It's a really great way of working out how to change processes. It's also written up on my blog, and you change processes differently depending on whether you're in that free space and it's something you should have predicted, or whether it's a 4 and 5 and what you should have done is put in safety nets in place, like rollback. Right? Rollback's a good example. If you put in rollback, the act of delivering doesn't throw you into chaos anymore. It becomes an experiment rather than a commitment. So the last thing I really want to get across is this idea that we should not always be looking for clear acceptance criteria for things. I see this on people's explicit process policies so often, and I found that the people, particularly with people who are doing BDD, and they push back on the business. They push back against the business's uncertainty, and all it does is end up with the most uncertain work at the end of the project, when you have the least time to respond to the discoveries. Instead, if the business are uncertain, they can't give you clear acceptance criteria, ask, is this because this has never been done before? Is it a 5 and 4? If it is, can we try something out? Can we spike something out for you? What would it roughly look like? Okay, let's give it a try and we'll get feedback as soon as possible. And that's a much more mature adult way to approach uncertainty than going, oh, I'm sorry, we can't accept that into our backlog. Okay, so I never want to hear this from anybody in this room again. Thank you.